Hey everybody, my name is Dominic, and this is going to be a video on the Hybrid Runecraft archetype in set 4. I'm typically not much of a rune player. I love Dirt, it's one of my favorite decks, but the class as a whole is something I've not engaged with very much prior to now. If you're a rune main, if this is something you play a lot, I don't think you necessarily need to go and sleeve up this deck and try it out for yourself, but I do think there are some concepts here that are underexplored, and they're worth looking into moving forward. I'm going to break this video into two halves. First, I'm just going to go and break down the deck, the card choices, things like that. And then I'm going to go into a conceptual explanation of Rune, my understanding of the different Rune mechanics, and hopefully there's something there that you find informative. Before we get into the breakdown, I want to do a quick introduction. This is a hybrid Rune deck, and that means we're going to be utilizing both Dirt and Spellchain. The poster cards for this archetype are Wizardess of Oz and Felice from set 3. Both cards have seen experimentation in Dirt Rune in the past, however I personally feel that only Felice has ever really fit the mid-range style of deck that Dirt has previously existed as. This deck is a control deck, and it's a very grindy control deck. We are not aiming to stall the game long enough to put a big bomb on the board. Instead, we are aiming for incremental value wins and trying to gas out our opponent. Something I really like about this deck is that it has a lot of agency. You have to make decisions turn after turn after turn, multiple times in a turn, and those decisions matter. You can throw really hard with this deck, but that also means you can carry. If you consistently make good choices, this deck will reward you. If you make wrong choices, this deck will punish you, and that is something that I really like in a deck. As far as the power level of this deck goes, it's not fantastic. It's better than I would expect it to be. I think it demonstrates good principles. I think there are strengths of this deck that are valuable to Rune as a whole. I think playing this deck was beneficial to me as a player, but as far as a competitive deck goes, this is not really it. On top of that, in most competitive settings, you're playing on a timer, and this deck can play very long. I would not advise bringing this to any timed setting. With all that being said, let's go into the breakdown. The first chunk of this deck is the Dirt package, and I would describe it as incredibly defensive on the whole. Between Gingerbread House and Concentration, we have access to double-digit healing over the course of a game. We are very resilient to burn. Golem Protection makes board-based decks really struggle to get meaningful combat damage into us. Again, very defensive. Wizardess of Oz, this is probably the most powerful defensive tool that Rune has access to. Imagine a situation where you are at a neutral board. The entire field is empty. Or maybe you have one Gingerbread House on the field. You play Wizardess of Oz, you get your 2 stacks, and now you choose to activate Golem Protection or Concentration from your hand, and again choose to use the extra Earthright effect if you have the spare stacks. You pass to your opponent with 1 stack on the field, and they have to choose, do they respect your hand or not? Do they think you have a quick spell that you will use with that quick effect? If they don't play around it, if they develop a King Elephant and just send it. If you don't have the removal spell, well, that sucks. But if you do, you feel really good for the rest of that game. That is a massive win for you. Usually that's not going to happen though. Your opponent's going to try to play around this quick effect. The most simple way that they can play around it is just remove her without going to combat. But she has 6 health. This card can be pretty difficult for a lot of decks to remove efficiently. If they're removing this card, they are usually not threatening your life total at the same time. They are not presenting a substantial offensive push. Just playing this card insulates you from your opponent's most dangerous threats. And if they remove her, you still have your removal spell in hand, and you still have that extra stack on the field that you can use for something else. You built resources, you burned your opponent's resources, you're feeling really good in that situation. Now, your opponent can choose to present a threat that is strong enough that you need to react, but not their best threat. Not the one that you're saving your execution for. And that's where things get tricky. That's where you really need to plan ahead, and that's where a lot of the counterplay and the interaction between the two decks happens. Often, the way your opponent will play into Wizards of Oz is by going wide. And that's where the complementary card Felice comes in. She punishes your opponent for developing wide boards. That's great, because Wizards of Oz is bad at dealing with wide boards. You can also use your leftover sediment token to give Felice Storm. So these cards play very well together. One of the issues with Wizards of Oz is not being able to play her because your opponent has a threatening board that you need to deal with first. That's also where Felice is great. Usually you can't play Wizards of Oz because your opponent has a wide board, and she will deal with that. If your opponent has one threat on the board, you can play Wizards of Oz. You just have to give up the Golem Protection or the Concentration and use a removal spell like Witch Bolt or Execution on your turn. That's not the worst thing ever. So this whole package plays very well together. These cards feed into each other. I think it functions very well. Something important to note with this current build is that we can only generate 7 stacks over the course of a game. And that might sound a little bit weird, given that we can spend well above 7 stacks with the cards that we have access to. Wizards of Oz herself, for all intents and purposes, consumes infinite stacks. So, why is the stack count so low? First, I really wanted to explore scarcity in stacks. Something that can come up in a pure dirt deck is a stack flood. You draw too many stacks, you've got 4 on the board, you can't spend them fast enough, and now you have resources that you invested in that are not manifesting in any tangible benefit. By keeping the stack count low, we should never be in a situation where we're flooding on stacks. They should always have value to us. We should always feel good when we draw a stack. And we can actually minimize the downside of not having enough stacks in 2 ways. The easiest one is Wizards of Oz herself. She's our primary stack spender, and she's also our primary generator. So in the situations where we need the stacks the most, we're already generating them. So that's not a problem. And our other stack spenders, they're all optional stack spenders. They all like their Earthright effect. They all really benefit from it, but it's not mandatory. If Spellchain 7 is active, Felice is already going to be playable. If we know our opponent has access to wideboard removal, where the number 3 and 4 on the golems is no different, we don't need to spend the Earthright on that. And concentration. Sometimes we don't want to draw extra because we already have all the resources we need and we don't want to push towards deck out. So with all of these being optional Earthright spenders, we really don't get punished by staying very low on stack count. The second half of our hybrid core is the Spellchain package. This is focused on enabling and utilizing the Spellchain 7 of Felice. Mithril Golem and Giant Chimera offer us extra copies of Felice, each with their own strengths and weaknesses. Between these cards and Wizards of Oz, we can see a strategy starting to form. Our Spellchain payoffs punish overdevelopment to the board, while Wizards of Oz punishes underdevelopment to the board. It is very difficult for our opponent to correctly navigate the space between. For that reason, it is very important that we not only reach Spellchain 7, but that we do so with enough health that we have the time to take advantage of that strategy. We will accomplish this via a minor active Spellchain package and a variety of removal spells. The accelerators I've decided on for this deck are Craig and Stella. These aren't the most powerful accelerators that Rune has, but I think they get the job done, and I think they have benefits that this deck values that are beyond acceleration. If we look at Penguin Wizard, that card potentially accelerates more than 2 spells for the same cost as Craig. But Penguin Wizard can only discard spells. Craig can discard any type of card. That means the moment we reach Spellchain 7 and we don't need these accelerators in our hand anymore, Craig can filter out extra copies of Craig. But Penguin Wizard cannot say the same. We will be stuck with extra wizards in our hand that we do not want. Another difference I think goes underappreciated, but is admittedly minor. Craig discarding after you draw means you'll always make a more informed discard with this card than you would with Penguin Wizard. Not a huge deal, but you play it enough, it comes up. Penguin Wizard is certainly a playable card in this deck, but I think Craig has that flexibility that edges out over the Penguin Wizard. Stella, not a fantastic accelerator, but she's card advantage. Her fanfare is drawing us a card, and later in the game, when we have enough play points to play her, followed by, let's say, Felice or Mithril Golem, that matters. Again, her acceleration is low, but between these two cards and the removal spells that we'll be playing along the way, we can get to Spellchain 7. It is certainly doable, and hopefully we do it with a good life total. And that's where really the removal matters, because these cards are not fighting for the board very well. Potentially the most important part of this deck is the removal suite. It is the largest portion of spells, and it is the most flexible portion of spells. You can and should adjust this to whatever you play against most frequently. Something to keep in mind with the damage-based removal spells. They all combo well with Felice to effectively punch up. Felice and Angelic Snipe together can address 6 health followers. And while you could do the same with a Snipe plus Witch Bolt, dedicating 2 spells to one enemy follower versus developing your own body while also removing one of your opponent's bodies, there's a big difference there. Snipe, if you play against a lot of aggro and you want more than 3 snipes, start looking into Lamplet Training or potentially Wind Blast, although that one not having quick is an issue. Surefire Bullet, if you only ever play against Uma, I guess you could play Fire Chain instead, or you could choose to add Fire Chains, up to you, but Surefire Bullet's great. Witch Bolt. Often you'll see this at 1 or 2 in Rune decks that want to use it with Merlin, the Merlin Evolve. This deck, you're not churning through cards as quickly as a typical Spellchain deck, which means you need more copies of this card to reliably see it with Stella flips, or to discard it with Craig, or really just to hard draw it and play it, because playing it for 3 feels good. You could search it with Merlin, but you have better cards that you want to be searching with Merlin than Witch Bolt. One of those cards is Rime Wind. This card is super, super important. If you're playing against Forest, King Elephant is actually not the biggest deal in the matchup. It's Sukuna. And that's because Rime Wind does such a fantastic job of delaying the Elephant until you're late enough in the game to hold up Fiery Embrace or hold up Execution. Cards like Sukuna, those are the ones that are hard to deal with. Evolved enemy followers, Mock Knight in Hero Sword, if it gets buffed outside of Surefire Bullet range. Those are the cards where, Rime Wind starts to get awkward, but in every other situation, against most threats, like in Ramp Dragon, let's say, Rime Wind gets you there. This card is fantastic. Now, Fiery Embrace is often not considered for Rune decks. You will always just play Execution, because the optional mode of destroying amulets, when it's relevant, is matchup defining. While the Spellchain 10 on Fiery Embrace is not that big of a deal. But if you're never destroying amulets, if you're only playing against Ramp Dragon and mid-range Forest, maybe Fable Haven, where you technically have amulets that you can kill, but you don't want to because it's really inefficient, Execution's not that great. You might as well just play Fiery Embrace, because if your default mode for Execution, or not default, but if the only mode for Execution is destroying followers, Fiery Embrace is strictly better. With that being said, if you play against Discard Dragon, you need Execution. So, again, adjust your removal accordingly. But do not sleep on Fiery Embrace. If you have this at 3, and you get Fiery Embrace to do 9 damage over the course of a game, this card's insane. So, don't sleep on Fiery Embrace. Do consider it. It's just matchup dependent. One last stop before we put the list together in full. The generic good Rune cards. Things we should be considering when we're putting together a list for Rune. Europa. This card is very easy to overlook. She's just a bundle of stats and keywords. But those stats and keywords, they play well together. Bane and Ward on a 5 health follower is very obnoxious. Board-based decks do not like to see this card. Most decks can't 1-for-1 this card. And even if they do, the Storm means that as long as you got some damage to the enemy leader with this card, you still feel good about that 1-for-1. A lot about this card is strong. Would the best version of this deck include her? Probably not. She's definitely optional, but I got that ulti. She ain't optional in my deck, that's for sure. Merlin. This is my favorite card in Rune, and I think for a lot of people, this is their favorite card in Rune. She is so satisfying to use. The decision making is very fun. The flexibility is powerful. Wonderful card. Absolutely has a spot in this deck. Now, Agnes Tachyon. This card also has a spot in the deck. However, the list I'm going to show here in a moment does not include her. And that's simply because I don't have her. I've tested her with proxies. She goes great in the deck. And for the most part, it's actually the recursion from her evolve that makes this card so desirable. But this card's amazing. If you've got it, include it. But this deck is not good enough to go and pick up some Tachyons for. Putting all of that together gets us a build that looks like this. Now, I know it says current build, but this is actually about a month old. I've made changes to the deck since, but I spent some time working on this video. I wasn't super pleased with the video, wasn't super pleased with where the deck was. I've made changes and not been super thrilled with all the changes. I think the deck is reaching about the ceiling where I could push it. But I think this version of the deck, this dated build, is the most presentable version. It's the one I've played the most. It's the one I'm the most realistically confident in. And I think if you're experienced with the game or with Rune or with Control, you can see the vision here. You can pick this up and make something happen. Some cards I did not touch on. Demonic Strike. This is just here for extra reach with Merlin. It's going to be good when you need it. Trail of Light and Insight. These are a minor active Spellchain package. Trail of Light is a little bit awkward. It's only good with Craig. You could theoretically discard it during the end step if you have more than 7 cards. But the only time in this deck that you're realistically getting above 7 cards is after you discard a Trail of Light to Craig. And at which point, that benefit is no longer there. So this is a bit of an awkward card. I've experimented with cutting it, replacing it with other stuff. But it feels really good. It feels really good. When you pop off with this and Craig, yeah, if you've done that before, you know. Now, as the deck size has gone up, that interaction has become less common, and that's why I'm looking to replace it. We can see here, this is a 45 card list. I started at 40. I promise I started at 40. I am a good boy. I promise you. But I was going to deck out. It was more common than I thought it would be. So I added extra cards. That could be the wrong line of thinking. Maybe the first 40 cards should be good enough. Increase the lethality of the deck rather than the girth of the deck. But maybe I like my decks a little girthy. And honestly, 45 is not even that bad. Between Craig, Stella, and Merlin, the deck has access to a lot of card selection. You can really mitigate some of the issues that come with increasing your deck size. On top of that, there's a lot of redundancy in the deck between Felice and Mithril Golem. If you're drawing one of them, you're okay. Angelic Snipe, you could add Lamplet Training for redundancy, all of the removal. As long as you're drawing some kind of removal, you're fine. So really, this deck doesn't need to draw anything super specific. As long as you're drawing the correct types of cards, if you maintain healthy ratios between removal and value and things like that, it's okay. If you have Tachyon, I think you can get up to 50. I've been trying to push to 50 without Tachyon, and it's been a little bit difficult. So I think 50 without Tachyon is too high, but this deck does not need to be 40 cards. I think you can comfortably play at 45. I have felt fine. You can try it for yourself if you want to, but I think for the most part, as an experiment on using the Wizardess of Oz in a more dedicated hybrid deck, I think this deck has been successful. Experimenting with the more lean Dirt package, I think, has been successful. And I think looking at Dirt as a more control-oriented mechanic or supporting a control deck in general, I think this deck demonstrates some potential there. To touch on a few alternatives real quick, Bellringer Angel is great in control decks. She has the issue of being a follower when we care about Spellchain. I think this is a card that I would like to play, but Spellchain is a demanding mechanic. Wind Blast, aka Y, is Blazing Breath Quick. This card is solid if you get the Spellchain 10, but not being quick before then really hurts. I think play 6 Snipe variants first before this. Teachings of Creation do not cut Gingerbread House for this card, but if you want more stacks, this would be the one to add. Tachyon, again, if you've got it, use it. Chain of Calling, there's potential there, but I think before reaching Spellchain 10, I don't really like this card. And as I've said, Spellchain 10 is quite demanding. Runeblade Summoner, for the same reason, Spellchain 10 is just a bit too much. But I like the idea of a Storm Rune deck between this, Europa, Felice. That's very appealing to me, but not very practical. Fate's Hand, because it's quick, you can use it with Wizardess of Oz if your opponent does not play something that you need to use removal on. I would not cut Concentration for Fate's Hand, but this is potentially a one-of option. I don't think you need it, but is not unplayable by any means. Golem Protection, again, in and out of the deck. When it's good, it's really good. I've been liking Junos in this deck. Against long grind matchups, an infinite value piece like this is nice to have, but getting it on the board is the hard part. It seems fine to me. I've seen builds of this archetype include Daria. I personally don't love Daria. My builds without Trail of Light, I think, would like the hand refill that she offers, but the build that I showed a moment ago felt wonderful without Daria, and I think this card is often a bit too casino for my taste. If you like Daria, go ahead and use her, though. Giant Chimera, again, always keep this in mind. Sometimes your deck, if you shape it, it could fit the Chimera better. I want to point out that Spellchain 10 is really the only thing that we care about. 20 is there as an upside. 30 is a meme. That is not a competitive line of text. Israfil, she makes a lot of sense in the deck. Healing, board wipe, big threat. I haven't tried it. I'm not going to try it, but Israfil definitely makes sense. As far as matchups go, I don't have a super thorough table to present, no spreadsheet full of win rates, and for the sake of video length, rather than going deep into a few matchups, I just want to give a surface level approach to matchups and glaze over a couple specific decks. First things first, as with all decks, you need to identify if the matchup is oriented around tempo or value. With this deck in particular, because deck out is a realistic scenario, you need to know very early on how important value is, how much do you need to maximize every bit of value from your removal spells, stuff like that. If you identify that too late in the game, you might have overcommitted resources early and it'll be too late. For tempo matchups, just use your removal to the best of your ability, defend your life total, and go from there. It's also important to identify your opponent's primary source of damage. Removal deals with board-based threats, while healing responds to burn. Healing does not address the board, and removal does nothing against burn. You can use Craig, Stella, and Merlin to shift your game plan to focus more on one or the other as needed. For specific decks, Fablehaven, the more mid-rangey builds of this deck I find incredibly favored. The more aggressive they get, 9 Goblins, Manu, Pinion Prayer. If your opening hand is a little bit light on removal, you'll probably take too much damage before you can stabilize, but anything more mid-rangey, you're going to be okay. Ramp Dragon, the greedier they get, the more control-y they try to play, the more Bahamuts they're running, the more difficult it gets, but this is the matchup that I've gone to deck out against the most. It is a very doable matchup. You just need to draw the right tools. The biggest issue is cards like Sybil, Shapeshifting Mage, and Dark Angel Olivia. These medium-sized threats can drain your removal before the big bombs start coming down. Mid-range Forest, if they're on Silverbolt, it can be a little bit difficult. Without Silverbolt, it's manageable. King Elephant is not that big of a threat for this deck. Maybe you'll get hit by it, but if you get hit by it, It's because of Sukuna. I think Sukuna is actually the best set 4 forest card. King Elephant is just the potent one. That's the one that sticks out. Sukuna, I think, is the win rate raiser. This card is insane, and in this matchup, she's very difficult to deal with and opens you up to their other threats. If you can play well around Sukuna, the Elephant is manageable, and you'll stabilize. They won't really be able to hit you. That's where Silverbolt comes in, but if they're not playing it, they're not playing it. I've taken Forest to deck out more than once. It's a realistic scenario, but for the most part, it just comes down to tempo. Discard Dragon, very difficult matchup. If you can respond to every Dracomancer's Rites with an execution, that helps. But Dragon Song Flute, spitting out 4/3 dragons turn after turn, will run you out of removal. And if they're running Star Phoenix, that infinitely recurable or basically infinitely recurable threat will eventually chip in for enough damage. You can only respond to so many instances of units on board. Potentially doable, but I find it very difficult. For a similar reason, Necrocharge Abyss is quite difficult. The steady stream of followers presented by Ector is going to run you out of removal. It's difficult to stop them from getting to Necrocharge 20, at which point you'll lose on the spot. Any sort of Control Abyss is going to be difficult. Azazel punishes preemptive healing, and most of this deck's healing is preemptive. So Hand Rip is going to be hard. Angel Abyss is going to be hard, and then of course Necrocharge Ector. So overall, the deck is reasonable into most decks, but you just have to really know what you're doing when you sit down with this deck. For the rest of this video, I just want to go through some Runecraft mechanics, the core archetypes for the class, just explain my understanding of them, and basically show my work. If something in the deck doesn't make sense, hopefully if I explain myself well enough here, you will see where I may have been led to make that mistake. Let's start with Earthright or Dirt. This is my favorite rune mechanic. It's the reason I play the class. I love Dirt. This is a builder-spender mechanic, and all that means is we're playing cards that build a resource and playing cards that spend that resource. There is no inherent archetype style that Dirt needs to be. It does not have to be mid-range, control, combo, anything like that. It entirely depends on what the builders do and what the spenders do. We have seen a wide variety in types of cards printed with Earthright in mind. The only type of deck I believe Earthright should never be able to support is aggro, and I think that's fairly obvious. Aggro needs to be pressuring the opponent's life total from turn 1, and the moment we spend any amount of time and resources building something, building stacks, we are not pressuring the opponent's life total. It won't really be aggro. The fastest is some form of tempo mid-range deck. Traditionally, Dirt has been a mid-range deck, but I think they have been steadily printing control tools that utilize the mechanic, and this deck is an exploration of those tools. I have not tried every type of Dirt control piece, but overall, I think as the game progresses, control Dirt is something to look into. No matter what type of Dirt deck you play, I think they all share one pretty universal strength. This is what appeals to me the most with the mechanic, and that's the ability to pay in advance. You can invest play points on a prior turn into a later turn and effectively receive a higher play point, effective play point turn at some point later in the game. The primary example I use for this, the most basic example, is Runic Guardian. As a 3-cost 3/4 ward on turn 3, that's really not something you want to be playing. But a 3-cost 4/6 ward, now you're calling my name, or at least in set 1 it did. But it's not a 3-drop when you're getting it as a 4/6. It's sort of a 4-drop. The base rate for a stack, especially in the early game, is 1 play point, and that's just from Teachings of Creation. So you're getting a 4-drop, but it's still coming out on turn 3. So you effectively had a 4 play point turn, but it was still on turn 3. Sort of like you ramped, and we know how good ramp is in Dragon. Now, Dirt is not quite ramping, but there are similarities. There is power there, and I think even in a control strategy, banking resources to use later in the game where you need to have incredibly high impact turns, that's still something that Dirt supports. Now, there are some issues that come with including Dirt. That mostly comes down to having two halves in your deck. You've got your builders and you've got your spenders. And if you're just drawing builders, if you're flooding on stacks, well, you're not getting much done there. And if you're only drawing spenders and you have nothing to spend, you're not getting very impactful cards either. Dirt is only really doing the thing when you draw both, and you draw a nice mix of both. In the mid-range decks, that's been accomplished by having a high count of stacks and spenders. For this deck, rather than trying to maximize the amount of times that Dirt is doing the thing, I chose to minimize the downsides of not doing the thing, not doing the builder and the spender. When we just draw builders or just draw spenders, we're still okay. That's the way this deck has approached that issue. But there absolutely could be a world where putting more stacks and more spenders into this deck is a valid plan to maximize the upside scenario, the builder plus spender scenario. But overall, Dirt, I think, is a very flexible mechanic. It's a very interesting mechanic, and moving forward, there's a lot that this can do, even as a small splash. Now on to Spellchain. This is the half of the deck that I am much less confident in. There are more issues that as I play, I find it's difficult to identify how much is just a flaw with the mechanic and how much is a flaw with the deck building. I'm certain there are elements of both. I view Spellchain as an achieved status. While Dirt builds and then spends, Spellchain builds and then is maintained. Once it is reached, it is not taken away, barring a few outlier cases. Now, there are two types of Spellchain cards. There are those that use it as a prerequisite. They lock a powerful effect behind a Spellchain threshold, and you will not play the card until you reach that threshold. And then there are those that use Spellchain as a bonus. Those are the ones where you would not choose to build Spellchain. You are not drawn to a Spellchain deck for their bonus effect. But when you get it, it's nice. So Runeblade Summoner as a 3-cost 1/1, you would never play. But a 3-cost 5/5 Storm, now that's a playable card. That's where it's a prerequisite. You will not play it until you reach that threshold. Fiery Embrace, on the other hand, you don't really care about the 3 burn. It's nice. It adds up. It feels good when you get it. But you would not build Spellchain for this. A very similar case would be a card like Cerberus in Abyss. Cerberus is powerful when you get the Necrocharge 10. But you wouldn't necessarily play a dedicated Necrocharge deck just for Cerberus. She's not the payoff that you need to commit a bunch of resources into building Necrocharge for. That's kind of a similar prerequisite versus bonus scenario from another class. Now, as far as building Spellchain goes, there are 2 primary methods, and these are probably not primary methods, these are probably the only methods. You can actively build Spellchain, or you can passively build Spellchain. So active Spellchain generation is when you're putting cards in your deck, and you are spending play points and time in the game purely to build Spellchain. A card like Insight does nothing. All it does is spin your wheels. If you pay 1 to just cycle a card, there are some probability and consistency considerations associated, but for the most part, you spent a play point doing nothing. Unless you care about that spell in your grave, at which point you did do something. You increased your Spellchain count. Penguin Wizard, again, not an incredible effect, just cycling through spells, while not useless, is also not something you would play just to play. If you're building Spellchain, though, he suddenly becomes a very powerful card. That's active Spellchain. You are taking time to build a Spellchain. And active Spellchain is important because it lets you reach those prerequisite Spellchain thresholds quicker. The more you're actively building Spellchain, the sooner you can play your prerequisite Spellchain cards, and the sooner you can cash in on the tempo loss associated with active Spellchain generation. The Spellchain as a bonus cards they appreciate the Spellchain acceleration, the active generation, but they're not going to pay off the tempo loss. They're not worth playing cards like Penguin Wizard just to turn on a Fiery Embrace. Now, passive Spellchain. This is where you just play a normal game, and decks typically have a mix of followers and spells. There are, of course, exceptions, but often you will find both spells and followers in a deck. And as the game goes on, some of those spells will work their way to your graveyard. And when you count them up, if the game goes on long enough, maybe you reach a Spellchain threshold. For this deck, just playing removal. If you're just playing removal turn after turn, play concentration to draw cards, eventually you're just going to get spells in your grave. That's the passive Spellchain generation, where they are only being counted to Spellchain because you would have played them anyways. That's where Spellchain as a bonus starts to get interesting. If you're not taking a tempo loss or anything to get your Spellchain bonus cards, suddenly they are just more impactful cards that scale as the game goes on. And that is something that this deck explores more than most Spellchain decks. Something I've always appreciated about Spellchain, especially with Spellchain being one of the core mechanics for Rune, is the impact it has on the class as a whole. Anytime the designers want to create a generic Rune follower, they need to give it some juice. It needs to be strong enough. Because if it's not generating Spellchain, and it doesn't count as a spell in the grave for Spellchain, and it doesn't pay off Spellchain, it can't really go into a Spellchain deck unless it's very good. A card like Europa would not really exist if they did not have to think about the opportunity cost of including followers in the spell class. There could be an argument for Dirt accomplishing similar impacts on the class. You know, if it doesn't build Dirt, if it doesn't spend Dirt, what are you doing? But Dirt is a much less committal mechanic than Spellchain. I think Spellchain is the one that has a larger impact on the class as a whole. After outlining the two mechanics in isolation, it should be reasonably obvious that there is no singular direction that a hybrid deck necessarily has to go. If both mechanics are pretty reliant on the types of cards that you choose to include, as long as we're including synergistic Dirt cards and synergistic Spellchain cards, if the strategies of those two packages are overlapping or complementing each other's weaknesses, there should be a reasonable strategy there. Both having somewhat high deck building cost, though, introduces some potential clunkiness. The best way to alleviate that clunkiness would just be to draw more cards. And how do you draw cards for free? You just take more turns. Every draw step is a free card. So longer games feel in line with this. And in theory, this extra opportunity cost should come with a high upside. Now, does it come with the upside? Honestly, no. But there could be. There could be some reward to taking on such a high deck building risk. The direction I went when looking at Hybrid was focusing in on Wizards of Oz and Felice and the way those two cards interact. In the Spellchain package section, I explained sort of how a strategy forms between these two cards. But at first glance, I think there's not a lot of obvious synergy between these two, at least with a mechanical, fundamental lens. Let's start with Spellchain. Felice Spellchain 7 feels like a prerequisite to me. She incentivizes active Spellchain. She's asking you to build your grave so that you can get this effect live at a reasonable point in the game. But the way Wizards of Oz interacts with spells is not in line with active Spellchain. She's much more passive Spellchain oriented. She's not turboing you cards into the grave. You're just playing cards naturally. And by virtue of playing cards, you're building Spellchain. But there's nothing purely Spellchain minded about Wizards of Oz in any capacity. She's purely making the spells that you already would be playing stronger by making them free. the types of cards you play with Wizards of Oz tend to be more defensive. You can include Demonic Strike and Dance of Death and play more burn-focused cards, more damage-oriented spells. But the wider card pool leans more into removal and card draw at roughly the 3 and 4 cost, especially Quick. If you want to use her Quick effect, one of the best targets is Execution. You don't want to just be throwing Execution at the first target that you see to build Spellchain, right? You want to play Execution when it's correct, and then it gets counted to your Spellchain. So Wizards of Oz really leans into this passive Spellchain. Let's look at the dirt half. Felice, Storm on a 4-drop. 4 attack, that's pretty aggressively slanted. While Wizards of Oz is, again, defensive. She's resource generator. She's building you stacks. So, mismatch, right? What's going on? How are these cards supposed to work together? Well, the Storm on Felice, as much as I like to go face, it's really rush with upsides. You can send this card face, but you can also just send it at a 4/4, have it left with 1 health, and then tell your opponent to deal with it. So, she can play board control if you need her to. She can be more defensive if you need her to. And then the active and passive Spellchain is actually less of a clash than it might sound. Spellchain 7 is lower than most prerequisite Spellchain cards. Some even go up to 15, like Flame Destroyer with D-Shift. So 7 being lower has a lot less demand on our active Spellchain, and it's reasonable that we could potentially accelerate between 3 and 5 cards, and then passively build the rest of the way to Spellchain 7. That makes Felice feel like we're getting a better return on our investment. If we are investing less effort into enabling Spellchain 7, the return relative to the investment is higher. Add on to that, passively building from 7 to 10 to enable Rime Wind is another huge bonus. That, again, is a good return for the relative investment. So Wizards of Oz leaning into passive Spellchain actually starts to kind of make sense. There's some strategy there that does not sound unreasonable to me. Is this the best strategy ever? No, of course not. But there's something there that's worth working with. With set 5 coming out soon, what do I think about this deck moving forward? Well, honestly, it's not even that great in set 4. So set 5, despite having a few cards that I think are reasonable slot-ins, it shouldn't really be much better. The deck is more of a thought experiment than a serious competitive deck or anything like that. Shoutouts to Stable for putting together these proxies. They are posted in the Discord. You just have to search for them. So first up, Truth's Adjudication. This is the best rune card coming out in set 5. I think that's pretty fair to say. The competition's not great, if we're being honest. The Sorcerer keyword, I'm pretty sure, is being officially translated as Mage. So this 2 or more Mage followers on your field clause. That sounds like a lot, and honestly, it sort of is, but at the end of the day, this card is a Demonic Strike with upsides. It's got extra modes, just a buff to Demonic Strike. Now, this deck runs Craig, Stella, Europa, Felice, and Wizardess of Oz as mage followers. And then most notably, Merlin is a mage. If you ever stick one of those first 5 followers on the field, next turn, you play Merlin, Evo, and use this, you'll get the Choose 2 mode. That is not an incredibly unrealistic scenario. So with this card, keep in mind, Merlin being a mage, if you ever have a follower on board, just Merlin gets you to the 2. So for other rune decks, keep in mind that that play pattern is available. Now, Lashena, this is a pretty dirtily do-nothing card. Hope you draw the outs to whatever your opponent's doing so that you can do her thing. That's not too different from what Hybrid Rune is doing, and she would really be a pretty reasonable 1 of in this current deck, maybe a 2 of if you wanted, just as extra healing, extra burn, nothing too crazy. I think most of the idle package that goes with her is pretty bad. Most of the cards are not that impressive, and that means there's a lot of room in the deck to experiment. And I think this Hybrid Rune deck, being so similar, leads me to think that there's a potential for a controlling Dirt package in a Lashena deck that you use those open idle slots for. The only issue is Dirt taking board space, but again, if you're not playing 2 Lashena down, which realistically I don't think you can, there's board space. You have board space. So if you're interested in Lashena, I think give this deck a try. Feel out the control side of Dirt, and maybe instead of Spellchain in this hybrid deck, you just run control Dirt plus Lashena and control tools. Gilnelise, again, just a nice late game value card that this deck would appreciate. Her being a follower means that the Spellchain part of the deck is likely not so feasible, and it would be best to move away from it, but I think that's okay. Between Lashena and Gilnelise, controlled Dirt plus these followers does not sound unrealistic to me. So looking at set 5, I think take lessons from how this Hybrid Rune deck functions and consider those cards in set 5 control builds. If you want any more information on this deck and you're in the community Discord, go to the Runecraft channel. You can search for Wizardess of Oz or Hybrid Rune or stuff like that. You'll probably be able to find where we've been talking about this deck in the past. 2 names here, Payaso and Captain. You can also search in the Runecraft channel for where they've been typing. I know they both have versions of this deck. You can find information on this deck if you go looking. And that brings us to the end of the video. This is the first time I've ever done a deck profile or video or anything of this sort. It was a learning experience for me. The first version of this video I was not super pleased with. I did not want to share. This version has barely reached the line of shareable, so please be gentle with me. With all that being said, thank you for taking the time to watch it. Thank you for listening. Hopefully this was helpful, and if you want to talk more about this deck, don't hesitate to contact me on Discord or hit me up in the comments. Bye-bye.